will determine so much of our collective future and Africa's future most particularly. Climate change is an accelerant of all other crises. That is why the next decade will be the most consequential. The climate crisis is urgent, it's catastrophic, but it has within it the opportunity for system change, profound system change. And I want to reflect for just a little bit to set the stage before we have a conversation among these incredible leaders. We have 7.5 years fundamentally to change the current trajectory that we are on. The combustion of fossil fuels is the largest driver of the climate crisis. It's created a blanket of pollution that wraps the earth and traps heat within it. The combustion of fossil fuels is also creating pollution that is resulting in 8 million premature deaths annually. And that same pollution has driven the extraction of fossil fuels has driven crises for over 100 years, impacting communities, driving harm for those that are least responsible for driving the current crisis. What will this lead to? We know catastrophic food system collapse, drought, floods, fires, conflict, refugee flows. The next 5 to 10 years will be so dramatic. And the time frame within which we have to shift the pattern of energy usage and who controls decisions about energy systems. Climate is and will continue to drive conflict, will cause collapse of governments, social security systems, spiral and feed intersectional crises. Climate change is an accelerant, and yet it offers the opportunity for system change. I'm not just talking about system change to renewable energy, but fundamental change in patterns of use of energy, the role of communities, who owns energy systems, and who sets and determines the future of communities and societies. This transition must be a just one that respects human rights and environmental boundaries, that rebuilds communities, that compensates for the effects of extraction, and reaches those that have never been reached by the fossil fuel energy system, who have been denied the right to power, the right to electricity. And that is not inevitable. Just as us addressing climate change within the time frame needed is not inevitable, the just transition is not inevitable. It will require building enormous power, putting demands on the existing system, global solidarity for the work that is happening in Africa, and adequate resources to affect that transition. And you have the privilege to hear from 4 of the leaders that are working within incredible community-based systems and strategies to drive that just transition. So here's what we're going to do. Each of these phenomenal leaders are going to speak for about 5 minutes, and they're not going to make me have to cut them off, right? Right? Okay, because that will feel so bad. So 5 minutes, and then I'll ask maybe a provocative question or 2. Then they'll ask each other a provocative question or 2, and then we'll open it up. So first, I'm going to turn to Makoma, who is the director of EarthLife Africa, a social, economic, and environmental activist who's been supporting communities in the fight against fossil fuels and nuclear energy and for a just transition. Makoma.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your opening remarks. I think you've just made it easier for us to be able just to get and delve into what really is at stake here. We always talk about just transition, and this has become some sort of a theoretical kind of gymnastics in boardrooms and in offices, but then it doesn't talk most of the time to what really happens to ordinary people. For us, the just transition, it has to transform people's lives, relationships to each other and to the planet. And that it's kind also of a disruption of what the keynote speaker spoke about yesterday, to somehow find a way of how it addresses the inequalities that we face, the unstableness of our lives, our economics, our social lives, and also the unsustainability of the environment, of ourselves, of looking forward. But this, to be just, it also, it has got to lead to an egalitarian society and also lead to an ecological regeneration. The just transition, it's driven by the situations that we find ourselves in caused by the climate disruption. And then that means we need to rebirth, we need to rebuild, we need to have a regeneration, and that it's already happening on the ground with people adapting to situations, sharing their knowledge, and also using indigenous knowledge systems to be able to survive and also to heal and build and rebirth the planet. But also, I'm summing up the just transition also, taking from an old adage or an old slogan that as activists we have been using and we're still also using up till today, that there will be no peace without justice. So the just transition is a justice issue, and it has got to address the restoration, it has got to address, and it also has the principles of restorative justice, that is to undo what has been unjust in the past, to rehabilitate and also to make right. The just transition also brings in the elements of procedural justice. This is something that we always have issues around, that there's never ever been free, prior, informed consent, particularly when there's a lot of projects that are being proposed in our areas come in. People are not part of decision making. People are not part of deciding whether they want or don't want those kind of projects. But also it speaks to our responsibility, the administrative justice of caring for the environment, of caring for nature. So the just transition, it involves maximizing the social and economic opportunities whilst carefully minimizing challenges brought by the climate change and the climate disruption. And we've seen ordinary people, communities actually doing that. And when you talk about climate action, this climate action is beyond declaration. This is what our people put our lives up for. This is what people have challenged. And we know the stories of how people challenged the Lamu power plant. And this was a way of saying we cannot allow carbon intensive projects in our environment because they're not benefiting to us. We know how people challenged the Lamu project in Kenya, and people challenged the Thabameti coal-fired power plant in South Africa. And that was like, we cannot allow carbon intensive projects. And people had laid their lives, they sacrificed their lives. And the East Africa crude oil project, this is also when people are saying we cannot allow this. This is the real action taken by ordinary people to say we need a transition, we need to do things differently and not the way business as usual goes about. We know people are putting up their lives to challenge the Musina Makaro Special Economic Zone, which is a mega toxic economic zone proposed in Limpopo. And these are what are the drivers of the just transition, We know what people are challenging the Okavango oil drilling. We know that in the coast of South Africa, people are challenging oil and gas exploration. So this is what ordinary people are involved in to drive the transition, to protect their livelihoods, to protect their heritage, their cultures and traditions. And I would invite everyone, if ever they have time, to watch Bliss of Ignorance. It's a documentary that was produced by Groundworks, Friends of the Earth, and it talks more, it highlights the lives of people living in coal areas, the externalized costs related to that, and how people are driving the transition by holding government accountable. Is my time over?
It is. That was perfect. That was perfect. Thank you. Thank you. So next we're going to turn to Tuli, who is the Africa Program Director of Oil Change International, also a long-standing environmental and human rights activist. I really hate introducing people and reducing them down to one phrase or one title of their work. It doesn't capture the power of these women, but Tuli, we'll turn to you next.
Thank you, Ellen, and thank you everyone for this opportunity. I think the story around the just transition, as Makoma has highlighted, it goes beyond just it goes beyond the just energy transition for us in Africa. It is a question of a just transition, and looking at all that has happened in the space of energy access and the oil, gas, and coal industry in the continent, one realizes that this transition, as we're talking about this transition, we need to excite the youth, make sure that the youth are at the forefront of whatever conversations are happening around this transition, because the projects, the toxic projects that are being proposed now, as Makoma has mentioned, the fossil fuel industry is actually harboring plans for expansion in the continent. So while science and the whole world agrees that the fossil fuel industry needs to shut down the way they are conducting business, they are in their boardrooms actually planning expansion. They are targeting new countries, and most of those frontiers that they are moving into are in Africa. They are in our countries. Makoma has touched on some of the projects like the East Africa crude oil pipeline, that is Uganda, entering the space of oil production. We have, Namibia, the Okavango Delta, being opened up for possible oil exploration, by Recon Africa. So all these projects that are being proposed now, they are going to lock the continent into this dirty energy trajectory that is harmful, is not delivering on any development goals in the continent, and actually mortgage the futures of the young people at this point, so that they will be locked into, continuing to manage, harbor, host these toxic projects, and not be able to use resources and develop technologies to leapfrog into the clean energy space, which is where everyone is going. So it is a way of locking in the continent so that we continue being the place where a toxic exploration of fossil fuels can continue and the industry can continue making money. So the young people really need to be encouraged to come to the front. We need to arm the young people with information, resources, because they cannot be in the fight just using their bare hands. We need resources for them to mobilize, to resist, to fight back in their communities. And in that space, as the social justice movement, we need to be in solidarity with the communities who are at the front lines of this project, because our governments, in their quest to fulfill, their debt obligations to, the northern governments and northern banks, they are becoming vicious, in their support for for this toxic industry. So we are seeing lots of arrests, harassment, even killings of, the frontline defenders, those community people who are protecting their territories and actually trying to exercise their right to say no to development that is not delivering to their immediate needs, which is what the fossil fuel industry has been about. It hasn't delivered. Africa is still in the dark. Despite so many years of extraction and producing oil and gas, we have what hosting all sorts of pollution. Look at the Niger Delta, how it looks right now after the oil industry has been there. And after 60 years of being in the Niger Delta, the industry is now beginning to sell pieces, of its toxic business to local entities because they are running away from cleaning up. They can see that the movement that is stopping them from continuing with this destruction is gaining traction. So they are beginning to try and escape the responsibility of cleaning up. So the young people really need to take up this fight, get into the space and make sure that the just transition is, locally based. It is delivering to the immediate local needs of communities and not continuing the trajectory of increasing profits for the fossil fuel industry.
Thank you so much, Tuli. Just two thoughts to help transition us from the provocation so far. The fossil fuel industry is corporate capture, has engaged in corporate capture for, frankly, many decades, if not 100 years. They've denied the science. They've spread disinformation about the effects of fossil fuels. They've made sure that governments suppress protest and restrict the rights of communities and prevented regulation so that the governments are basically unable to advance real work on climate change and the just transition. Therefore, social movements have been targeting finance as a lever to stop the expansion of fossil fuels, to say we might not be able to get policy change now, but we're going to go after the money and cut it off. We're going to make sure that public finance, private finance does not go into new fossil fuel projects, whether it's investors or banks and the like. And conversely, we need to move rapidly towards the energy transition, scaling the solutions, renewable energy, and that it too has to be a just sector. But it's not inevitable that renewable energy will reach everyone that doesn't have energy access today. 800 million people in Africa do not have access to electricity. And so how will we ensure that an energy transition isn't just going to reach industries and major cities, but get to the last mile as well? Everjoice Wynn is the director of the Shine campaign, which is looking at deploying finance as a way to scale solutions. Everjoice comes from the global women's movement and is working on strategies that are women-led, community-driven solutions for energy access. EJ.
Thank you, Ellen, and thanks, colleagues, for inviting me to be part of this panel. I think I would just go straight for it and start with what is this moment that we are in order to contextualize some of the points that I will make later. Whichever way you look at it, the current war in Ukraine is an energy war. I think that's just the way we need to look at it. Yes, there are many other factors, the geopolitics, all of that, but I think let's look at it squarely as this is an energy war. And we've already seen the ramifications throughout the world. So this is a moment for us as civil society, as movements, but as all other actors, to reimagine a continent and a world free from fossil fuels. I think we have this amazing opportunity. But as Ellen was saying, and I think as the other two colleagues have said, we need to move beyond that reimagination to say, how do we catalyze and how do we make use of this moment? I think the second thing about this moment is that it's a moment to center gender inequality. It is also a moment to center the needs and the rights of people at the so-called last mile. So that's the terminology we use in the energy sector. In development, you would call it grassroots, neglected communities. In the energy sector, we talk about the last mile. So this is an opportunity to center the needs and the rights of people at the last mile, particularly women, because as we heard yesterday, the care burden for women, when you look at why energy access is so important, when you look at it from a gender lens, you see that it is women who are saddled with drudgery. It is women who are carrying the burdens of taking care of communities. It is women who don't have access to health facilities that have electricity to power them, and it impacts their health. So does it on most communities. I think the other thing of this moment is that it is also a moment to center conversations on loss and damage, because we already know, right, the devastating effects that climate change has had. We've already seen clear illustrations, whether it's the Durban floods, whether it's Pakistan, whether it's the drought in East Africa. So at this moment in time, we need to have a robust conversation and push onto the agenda the issue of loss and damage. I'm glad to say it seems it has been put on the COP27 agenda, but whether that will yield the resources is another story altogether. I think the other thing is also for us to center the conversation on adaptation. So what exactly does adaptation look like? And what does it mean for women, for last mile communities? And hence conversations about the resources from the climate conversations, that those resources need to go into adaptation, particularly pivoting away from fossil fuels. The other point, I think, is this is a moment for us as movements to re-look and re-examine the ways in which we organize. And I think this was mentioned yesterday by several people. We can no longer afford single issue struggles. We can no longer afford to disperse ourselves too much, right? This moment we are working on energy, tomorrow we are working on climate, tomorrow we are working on gender, next week we might touch on LGBTI issues. This is a moment to really look at how we work cross-movement and build stronger movements, because we know that the root causes of all of the issues we are dealing with, no matter how diverse we are, the root causes of them, the structural causes of them are exactly the same. They just affect us and they nuance differently. Finally, I think in terms of the moment, it's the challenge for the philanthropy world to look at how do we fund and who do we fund, right? And I'm glad to say within the feminist funding movement, we have seen changes where money is now going to straight to frontline women's groups, the ones who live the reality. We are looking at more trust-based resourcing of movements. We are looking at donors beginning to change some of their, very complicated systems and processes in order to ensure that movements get the money that they need very urgently and at the time that they need them without having to jump through hoops. At the Shine campaign, we raised a very small sum of money during COVID, $110, $110,000. You will be amazed. Within a space of 1 year, we had given out that money, small sums of money, $10,000, $7,000 here. But the amount of work that was done by the organizations that we gave this money to on the continent is amazing. Just to give you one example, one organization in Tanzania that we gave money to was able to electrify 3 health clinics. And when you look at the number of people that each of those health clinics serves, you look at a massive impact, right? So just a small amount of money going a long way. And I'm not saying to funders give us small money, but I'm also saying sometimes we have a tendency to think that people are asking for billions of dollars. And that's the conversation within the energy sector. I have to say, coming from the women's movement, my eyes are always popping when I hear the figures. IKEA has committed 17 million. Goodness me. Bloomberg is giving 135 million. Really? In the women's movement, if you talk 200,000, if we talk 200,000, it's like a huge amount of money. So the challenge for philanthropy is to rethink as well. Who are we funding? And how do we fund those frontline groups that need this money urgently, that need to organize, but they organize very differently from the traditional systems that we know? Thank you.
Brilliant. I accept that challenge to philanthropy. I'm going to help you amplify that. Thanks for raising those issues about money getting directly to communities. So let's dig deeper into how communities are opposing fossil fuel expansion, are advancing the just transition, and ensuring that a new renewable energy industrial sector and the rush for critical minerals associated with renewable energy will not bring a new wave of harm. And I'm not expecting you to speak just to that issue, but we'll turn now to Ekal, who is the founder and director of the Friends of Lake Turkana, and also another amazing leader and recipient of the Goldman Prize. 3 of our 4 panelists are recipients of what is called the Environmental Nobel Prize. So just take a moment and shout that out.
Thank you. I'll just build on what my sisters have said, looking at the different moments. One, we have a privatization of public goods happening in the continent, from water to education. Many of us look back at our education system, and right now everything is being privatized. So there's a serious privatization. We have a problem with food production. This recently, our government is looking at GMO. Yesterday, someone joked and said, South Africa has already sort of taken the GMO story very far because of the size of the apple. So the food production systems, we're moving away from the narrative of food security and food sovereignty. Criminalization of seeds and sharing seeds in the continent is happening. We have infrastructure that is being built not to move people and knowledge, but to move resources and minerals, whether it is from power from the Inga to continue to extract minerals. We have a struggle around migration. So with the droughts, and I know this is happening in West Africa, in East Africa, that I'm a pastoralist. And so migration did not recognize the borders, but right now there's a barrier to migration of people, of animals, just of survival. You have a new word, the blue economy, that's being thrown everywhere without understanding what is this blue economy, and did we have a blue economy that we were already benefiting from before, but now is being commodified and commercialized. So you have all those struggles. When Guinea had a coup last year, there was very little about what the people of Guinea were going through. But then there was a whole discussion around Guinea being the largest bauxite producer in China, and China was wondering, who now do they negotiate with? There's land reforms and the keynote speakers speaking about some Moyo and the land reforms that are not necessarily land reforms for the people of the continent. It is land reforms to enable corporates, the corporate world to come in and easily acquire the land. So we think it is land for us, but it is not land reforms for us. It is land reforms to enable. When I first got into this work, I remember meeting Makoma, and she was pushing for renewable energy. And I was telling her that my first campaign against energy was against renewable energy because of the struggle of the people of, the Omo Turkana Basin, because we are fighting the 3 largest dams, Mpandankua, the flooding that's happening. If you look at the Inga, the struggles that the renewable energy projects are not necessarily for the people, but it is just under this narrative, as Tuli said, the dark continent. So we're looking at all this, and whether we like it or not, we are now sitting at an extraction that is coming for the continent. Bauxite, lithium, aluminium, copper. We're seeing all this now discussions around how do we extract? And if we don't have the systems change that we are talking about, we're going to suffer an extractivist. It's not going to be oil, but everything that has happened in the Niger Delta will happen in many Niger deltas in the continent. Again, a very extractivist process. If you look at how our governments are thinking about it, it's just really around how they get the money, but not how the processes are done. And so we've got to ask ourselves, how we do it and how this different conversations are happening from food production, privatization of the public good, you know, from healthcare to education to water. You're looking at food systems to the energy systems. And if we talk about energy poverty, it's not just the electricity, because the energy is more than just light bulb. It's the production and reproduction systems around which African women live with. And so it's how we look at this. And for me, it's the challenge around, you know, I'm privileged to be in spaces where I'm with the feminist movement, with the energy climate crisis movement, with pastoralists. But how do we link the struggles? Because there are struggles around the ability to survive and thrive within our ecosystems without being boxed into one narrative. And so for us, it's really rethinking and allowing ourselves to unlearn a lot of the things that we've been asked to do or been organized around. How do we, as she said, how do we work with formal and informal systems, informal and informal groups, but just allowing a space of learning and unlearning, but bringing our voices together to really create a stronger movement.
Wow, thank you. I just want to punctuate one thing about the privatization. We know that climate change is going to make water a much more precious commodity. And already we're seeing a worldwide push to privatize water. And yet, while we have some activists in the room that are working on the right to water, access to water as a justice issue, really our ecosystem of response to protect water sources for people, not for industrialization or for the elite or commodification, is very thin. And so as we think about interconnected struggles, we have to be thinking about the privatization of water. I do want to open up a question. We'll then kind of provoke each other. So in a month, the UN COP will be happening in Egypt. And I just want to say, in Sharm el Sheikh, designed to be a place that would allow the repression of civil society. Must acknowledge that. And of course, it will be happening against the backdrop of the Ukrainian war and the push for more expansion and extraction of fossil fuels. How is this going to play out for your advocacy and your work? Will this be an opportunity to lift up the community voices for a new pathway? And let's tackle that Ukraine energy war question that EJ raised. Who wants to go?
So according to our governments, and I'm paraphrasing this deliberately, it is Africa's time to pollute. Basically, that's their bottom line. If you look at the Africa Common Position on the just transition, and you can look it up online, in one sentence, they are saying, it is our turn to pollute. We are not responsible for the pollution that's happened in the world. We are not responsible for all the problems that you're talking about in terms of climate change. Indeed, we agree with them that Africa is paying the price. However, instead of our governments looking at this moment as a moment to, and I'm going to use a word so my sisters can laugh, pivot from, from fossil fuels, they are saying, no. Give us our time because we need to industrialize and because we didn't pollute enough. So give us the chance to extract as much as we can, hence Mozambique, hence even Zimbabwe is now busy drilling for oil, and every other country that you can think of. So I think this is one of the key things that we are facing at COP and beyond. This issue of how do we position ourselves and not be seen as anti-development and not be seen as anti-industrialization because we are saying, no, it is not time for Africa to pollute.
Indeed, our governments keep, singing this song that it's Africa's time to pollute, but the reality is that Africa will not be polluting. We will be continuing to feed this existing system, because what is happening now is that Africa is the point of extraction. That is where the raw fossil fuels are extracted from, and then they get into a pipeline. So when you look at all the pipelines that are crisscrossing the continent, they are moving from the source of extraction to an exit point, be it oil, gas, or coal. So Africa will continue being the point of extraction, and then the north will continue, burning and polluting some more. Because the reality is that the burning is not happening in the continent. So the industrialization that we are hoping for from, continued extraction of fossil fuels is false. Looking at how, in terms of what is currently prevailing in the space, our continent only remains with less than 40% of the profits from the sector. And then they'll tell you about the job story, that it's going to create jobs, it's going to drive our economies. That is not true. When you look at the combined, contribution of the extractive sector to labor or to employment, in the continent, it's only 1% of labor, and the quality of those jobs is very questionable. So it's all those stories that are being sold to us about development. But with the COP coming up, this COP is particularly important for the continent because of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Again, a conflict that is happening so far away from us is actually having, major implications in the continent. Because whilst in Glasgow last year, at the last COP, we walked away with a feeling that maybe we are making, some progress, because a number of the major countries who are funding and using fossil fuels were actually making pronouncements around moving away from fossil fuels. They're putting timelines, they were committing to not funding the industry anymore. But when the Russia-Ukraine conflict broke, all those commitments have been walked back by those governments. And that is worrying. But what is more worrying for us, and we should brace ourselves for an even bigger aggressive fight, it's how the North is suddenly coming into Africa, with their checks and credit cards, and using us as a shopping mall for gas. So we are seeing our countries, falling over themselves, our governments specifically, trying to open up the space to provide gas, because there is a shortage of gas and fossil fuels in the developed countries, because Russia and Ukraine have created this gap. So even the narrative on the face of it around why Africa needs to open up for more gas extraction, it's not saying so that Africa can benefit. It is saying the North needs the gas because they have a crisis. So again, the needs of Africa for energy will not be provided for under this time. But then we are going into Egypt with that, narrative that is being pushed by the industry, the northern governments, and our governments are sort of falling for it, that gas is a bridge fuel. Gas is necessary for development in the continent, so we should open up some more. So we should expect Egypt to be a big fight, and to be an even bigger fight around how we move forward.
Yes, there's so much excitement that the Conference of the Parties is going to be held in Africa, in Egypt. Actually, Sis Tuli reminded me last month when I was consulting with her regarding some facts. She said it's actually the COP in Egypt. It will be hosted in Africa for the 5th time. There's been other 4 times when the Conference of the Parties took place in Africa. And I think the question that we ask ourselves is that in all the other COPs, there was also an excitement that the continent that bears the burden of negative climate change impacts is hosting the COP. And all in Durban, we were hopeful. In Morocco, we were hopeful. In Nairobi, we were hopeful. And we thought that something's going to come up. And in South Africa, we're saying this is the land of possibilities. And taking the miracle of 1994, we were expecting that would come up with a convention on climate change at Durban, and that did not happen. But what is, I think, of importance for this COP is that civil society organizations have been able to put up the issue of loss and damage back into the agenda. It's not the first time that the issue is at the center. There was also the time when the terminology was different. The terminology was around common and differentiated responsibilities. And so it's a continuation, different language. And at this climate change negotiations, we see every time language changes, but it really means the same thing. And I'm just wondering what we're going to come up at the COP. But then when we were at Glasgow last year, South Africa received what is called the Just Energy Transition funds. And these funds came in to assist South Africa to transition or to accelerate the transition, because South Africa is seen as the leader in Africa in negotiations and also in efforts for the just transition. And because of a body that was initiated by the President, Ramaphosa, the Presidential Climate Change Commission, which for some of us, our sins, we are part of. And the money was given to what's assisting the transition of South Africa. But we see this year, what we foresee from what we're getting from Intel, it's that there's more money that is going to be given, and also to different countries. But this money being given, it should be money for loss and damage. It should not be coming as loans. It should be the money that comes as part of the restorative justice of the just transition, of saying, yes, we are aware, particularly that the money comes from the UK, comes from France, comes from the European Union and the US, to say that we are responsible for the situation we are responsible for the burning of Africa. So we have to make amends to that. We have got to redress, at least try to do things right. But then it puts us in a very difficult situation as South Africans, because what we're doing, whether it's wrong, it's going to be replicated in other countries. Nigeria also is set to get those just energy transition funds. I think other countries, Vietnam also, and Vietnam, very repressive, same as Egypt. We're not saying that South Africa is not repressive, it is repressive, but the repressiveness of South Africa particularly, we may know of other cases, but of Mamjanga, Sebo Bazuga, but then the repression is so covert that sometimes it's not even seen that it's repression. It may be said that this is just an ordinary or outside crime or whatever that happens. And the protection of environmental defenders needs to be at the center, and also as part of what the convention has got to put in text, because if the protection of environmental defenders, it's not there, we'll continue to be maimed and killed for protection of the environment and for calling for the mitigation against climate change. Thank you.
So Ikao, do you want to respond as well?
just
And then we'll
very-
take
yes.
one or two questions from the
Very,
audience.
very shortly. I think for me, it's a catch-22. We have a very skewed global financial infrastructure that would be the channel of this funding to the continent. And so as we push for it, the flip side is that what is the implication for the extractivist nature that will come with the critical minerals? Are we opening up a way that then they'd say, well, we will pay for loss and damage so we can come and extract your bauxite, lithium in the same environmental, poor, just the same way, because the extraction of fossil fuels is the same. I mean, we've struggled with the copper, the mining in the continent. So unless we are able to discuss that framework, the system that the mining has happened, and we allow it. So it's one of those that loss and damage, we've got to do it in a way that ensures that going forward, we reimagine a new way of financing. And we cannot talk about addressing the climate crisis demanding for this financing without demanding for a whole, restructuring that economic, the financial infrastructure, because that's what is used to push us down, and that's what will be used to continue the exploitation of the continent.
Oh my, okay. I saw, maybe because of where I was sitting, I saw those two hands go up in the back first, so,
Which two?
okay, so you right here in the front and then in the back, yes.
Okay, and then which one's in the back? Because I'll field them.
Straight,
Ma-
it was my line of sight,
Me-
sorry.
Merci,
Okay, go
merci,
ahead.
merci beaucoup.
Fatima.
Yes.
Thank you so much for seeing me. Thank you very much to the panelists. I think that, I think that the points that you bring up is really critical, especially in relation to the learnings from fossil fuels. But in addition to having a restructuring of finance system, we have to think about a restructuring of the extractive industry. Because even now, and I know that, we've been working with Comrade Makoma and EarthLife in looking at some of the minerals that are going to be needed for the so-called transition, right? Which means there's going to be mining, and mining that is happening in the same ways, right? So I think there is an opportunity. I don't think that African governments can go, whoop, it's not our problem, it's our time to pollute, like Comrade EJ said. But I do think it is an opportunity to talk about reparations, right? To talk about how is this transition going to be different? Because what we're seeing now is indicators that show that it's just neo-colonial extractivism, where Germany is pumping money into South Africa around green hydrogen, right? So that it can take the green hydrogen once it's produced. It's not doing it to ensure that green hydrogen will fuel our economies in Africa. It's to ensure that nothing changes and that the global north is not inconvenienced by climate change.
Who wants to
right?
speak to this? Who wants to speak? Yeah, we'll take the
Okay.
question.
So let's take the two questions at the back that you had flagged. Let's take all questions or comments off of the floor that had been flagged. Hold on. There were two that were flagged. Is it
No, it's me.
is it in the blue shirt?
It's me.
In the blue jacket?
now.
Dark blue shirt.
Dark blue? That's fine. That's okay. I'm just checking. There's two questions. So we've got one there. And where's the second one? You had said two. Okay, it's fine. We'll find a way. So let's go with you and then we'll see it just now. Go ahead.
Ok, mais merci beaucoup. Peut-être que je vais laisser un peu de temps pour les quatre.
Okay, just give us 2 seconds. Everybody earphones on.
We don't have them up here. So
You do, right next to you.
They don't work up here.
They don't reach there. Yeah, perhaps let's try it. I think they had corrected that error, so let's try it. I can fetch more. Thank you.
Okay, it's work. It is working.
Yeah, it is working. Sure. Okay, you can go ahead.
Ok, merci beaucoup. Et d'entrée de jeu, je suis Zongo Touendenda du Burkina Faso.
Because people don't have, mine's not working on English and some folks don't have theirs on yet. Can you? I can't get to them. Don't worry about it. Truly, will you leave?
Okay, can the panelists hear at least at a minimum? Okay.
Okay, we sorted ourselves. Everybody ready? Can you hear?
Ok, merci. Je dis, je suis Zongo Touendenda du Burkina Faso. Alors, j'apprécie l'ouverture de ce barrage sur des questions sectorielles comme le changement climatique. Mais aussi, je voudrais justement préciser que toutes ces questions environnementales aussi renvoient plus ou moins aussi à des questions de gouvernance. À des questions de gouvernance, parce que je prends l'exemple de mon pays, le Burkina Faso, qui commence à être un pays minier, donc qui a plusieurs sites d'extraction aurifère. Mais il y a des mines qui sont déjà en fin de vie, en fin d'exploitation, mais qui laissent une excavation totale qu'on croyait qu'il y allait avoir une réhabilitation. Ça veut dire qu'on croyait qu'on allait refermer totalement les trous qui avaient été creusés. Mais à notre grande surprise, on voit que c'est resté comme ça. Et quand on a voulu pousser pour savoir, on dit non, qu'il y avait un fonds minier qui était reversé au niveau du gouvernement pour préparer l'après-mine. L'après-mine, c'est-à-dire pour réparer. Mais ça n'a pas été fait. Ça n'a pas été fait. Donc, je pense que ce sont des questions de gouvernance, de mal-gouvernance, et que peut-être les mouvements sociaux doivent s'engager aussi peut-être à faire la veille, afin que durant tout le processus, rien ne soit négligé, et surtout le côté environnemental, le côté écologique. Donc, ce sont ce commentaire-là que je voulais faire pour dire que vraiment, il faut une veille. Sinon, les autres viendront creuser, en tout cas, créer le désastre écologique chez vous et partir, et puis vous laisser avec peut-être des ruines. Merci beaucoup.
Okay, thank you. I'm unfortunately going to leave it there, and then we'll give the panelists either a chance to respond to the two questions before we break for a tea break. Whatever is a question, please write it down on the post-it notes. We are going to have to revisit it. I cannot revisit these questions right now, unfortunately. I'm very sorry. Do write it down. We will have a moment later. We will have a moment later. There's time that has been built in today, specifically in response to yesterday.
And as
So
the,
let's get the
as
answers
the
from
panel
them.
responds to the two questions, also share some inspiration about people power, short flash round. Okay.
Thank you very much. The question, the question from Zongo, or the comments that came from his statement, it's around governance. And I think this is what people are doing all over the continent, of reclaiming their power, of going back to how to manage natural resources in their areas and how they do that. This is where people adapt and also use Sankofa, learning from the past so that we can create the future. And this way of managing or protecting our natural resources, this is where the power of the people is evident. And it's evident in such that people's power also is resisting anything that would disrupt and destroy what's around them, what they connected to. So I love that, because it reminds us that we have the power in our hands. Yes, there is something written down as to this is how that needs to be done. Most of the time that remains on paper, and what people are practically doing, it's what I think we need to do, reclaiming our power in protecting our natural resources.
She said it all. Anyway, I think in appreciation that what we eat, what we wear, everything that we touch, the senses that we have, the basic senses that we, know from childhood, is really related to nature. It's soil, it's water, it is. So if we look at it from that perspective, and I think that's what, when people talk about, when you asked what keeps us going, it's when you step on the ground. That's why many people walk bare feet, because you ground yourself to something. And just being conscious that you're there at that particular moment, that you breathe, you smell, and and knowing and being with people who constantly, so that power within communities that they understand what they produce, what they cook, what they touch, what they see, and this is across generations, is something that we cannot ignore. And really critical is that when we think about the struggle, we should not really see it as ours on our own. As Tehani's quote said, when you want to see change, it's one person, but really if you're looking at the change that goes beyond you, then you've got to bring in other people. And so when we look at that struggle from the lens of me, you've got to look at it and say, okay, how many other different lenses can I see, and really bring that power together. And I guess that's why the song, and I was telling Ali, the song and dance within African culture really is how we communicate. That's how, the sound of the drums goes beyond that particular place. So let's really build into who we are, where we come from, but also see that as, as in a bigger way.
I only have one thing to add. Another key thing in this moment is that we have an opportunity for solidarity between the global north and the global south, particularly between Africa and Europe. We have a global south within Europe, right? And that is the global south that is going to suffer the consequences of the energy crisis that they are going to experience, or they are already experiencing. So we need to think about how do we connect the struggles that we've been having in the global south around energy access and the people who are suffering from the current issues around energy access for marginalized groups in the north. And I think we have an amazing opportunity again to link up, to work cross-sectorally, to work intra-movement, and to be able to push for a bigger change at a global scale.
I can add one more thing to that, we really need to continue working in solidarity, linking, all the issues that we have. We should try and not keep them in silos. So in our movements, we should make sure that we are covering and connecting all the issues that are affecting the continent, which is why I like the space actually, because in this space, I've talked to people who are working on so many aspects of social justice in one space. And that is what we should keep doing. And then one other thing we should do in our continent, with the Global South, and I think EJ is saying even with the North, it's to continue learning from each other, create opportunities for learning, for sharing. In the space, in our space, we use what we call exchanges, community exchanges. So take a community from Namibia, the Okavango, Botswana, where the Okavango project, where the oil is going to. Take those communities for a visit to the Niger Delta, have them be hosted by the communities in Niger Delta so they can see, how that delta looks now and how their delta will look also if the oil projects go ahead. So those conversations make us stronger. They link up the issues, and they help us share the burden, and also hopefully just push back and push the boundaries towards a space where we can have our development that is responding to what we need in our communities and in our continent.
A powerful ending by 4 powerful leaders. Thank them, please.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you.